Thank you, everyone. I'm very pleased to be here, and I'm going to speak tonight about 5 things you might not know about officers. This is partly inspired by a blog that I write about my research and about my insights into this, both gathered from my research at UCL and from the workplace consultancy practice with Spacelab. So I'm interested in the overlap or the interaction between people and space. So on the space side, we have things like visibility, proximity, the way how people get together. On the people side, we have all sorts of things that people do, interactions, organizational behaviors, organizational cultures, and how those two interact is my key interest in my research. As I said, I'm going to talk about 5 things you might not know about officers. All of this is some of my latest thinking and latest research, and some of it will be an outlook into the future of work and how we can actually understand offices and the places where we do work. Number 1, the office is not dead. We hear very often that with the onset of electronic communication, with IT, with laptops, with iPads, we increasingly could work from anywhere. Do we need the office? So the office is dead has been announced so many times on the internet that I really get tired of this. So I thought it's time to think about, is the office really dead? And I would say no, the office is not dead. So let me tell you why. I think the office as a place is an important condition and an important place for us to go to. And it basically affords 3 main things: co-presence, encounter, and routines. So the first bit on co-presence, I'm actually going to read here because it's a really nice quote from Bill Hillier in Space is the Machine. And it says, "Co-present individuals may not know each other, but co-presence still is a social fact and a social resource. Co-present people are not a community, but they are part of the raw material for community. Even without conversion into interaction, patterns of co-presence are a psychological resource, precisely because co-presence is the primitive form of our awareness of others." So offices afford this co-presence with others as a psychological resource. Of course, this affordance of space happens in all sorts of other places as well. If you, for instance, as in the picture here, go to the British Library and work from one of their workplaces, you get some sort of co-presence as well. So this one, you could actually take out into a coffee shop, into other places of work, but still the office affords co-presence. Now, the second point, encounter. The office is actually the place where you meet other people. And I think that's the strongest point about it, really. You can interact with your co-workers, you can meet around the water cooler, have a cup of coffee together, talk about things, you bump into people in the corridor. So those spontaneous encounters, serendipity, is actually something that is quite important in the office. And that is only afforded by a place where you actually bump into the same people all the time. Because who of us would strike a conversation with someone else working in the British Library? I guess not many of us would do. The third bit is about routines and habits. By going to the same place every day, or almost every day, you develop some sort of habits, routines, and you have a shared identity. So the shared workplace and the shared identity is actually an important fact of going into the office every day. And usage patterns allow you to interact in a quite special way. Organizational cultures actually arise out of this shared identity. So those 3 things are afforded by the office, and I believe they are important, and the office is far from dead. Let's move to number 2. Electronic contact mirrors face-to-face contact. Now that might be a bit of a surprise, really, because if you think about it, again, it's the same sort of argument. Now that we have email, now that we have Facebook and Twitter and all of the ways for people to interact, we actually don't need face-to-face. We don't need to come to the office to interact with the people that matter. But what I would argue here is that it actually does matter to meet people face-to-face, but interestingly, all of the opportunities to interact with all sorts of different people around the world are not taken up, statistically speaking. So if you look at those 2 network graphs, so part of my research is to ask members of staff to fill in interaction surveys and ask them, who do you interact with of your colleagues face-to-face? And how often do you see them? And who do you interact with electronically, via electronic means? It turns out there's a great degree of overlap between those two types of networks. In the case that I'm showing here, a media agency, the overlap is 80%. So there's an 80% overlap between who we see face-to-face and who we actually email. Isn't that astonishing? Wouldn't you think that email allows us to interact with those that we don't see face-to-face? Now, what's interesting is that this degree of overlap varies. So some of the studies that I did, one in Cambridge University, the degree of overlap was 64 to 69%, depending on whether I look at planned interactions or unplanned interactions. And in another study I did in a hospital environment, where I asked the caregivers to tell me who they interacted with, the doctors and nurses in outpatient clinics. One case in the Netherlands had 90% of overlap. The other case only had 30% of overlap. So huge differences between those two places. Now, with only 3 cases, I can only hypothesize why there's such a huge variation. And I believe, but that's a working hypothesis, is that open workplaces that have higher degrees of visibility, that are more integrated as a whole, have a higher degree of overlap. Or in other words, those that are very segregated, so that hospital with a 30% overlap had very segregated spaces, traditional corridors, cellular offices, cellular exam rooms, very segregated and closed up. And the Cambridge University has cellular offices as well. So in those more segregated spaces, possibly because the space doesn't really afford the face-to-face encounter that well, possibly people would use electronic communication to overcome what space doesn't do. But that's a working hypothesis, and until I have more data, I can't really tell more. Now, number 3, movement helps you think. In space syntax, we care a lot about movement because spatial configuration gives rise to movement gives rise to encounter. So movement is really one of the things that we look at a lot. But what we find is that movement has also different affordances and different things happen with movement. So what you see here is a movement study that I did on a research institute. And you can see the traditional movement flow patterns that we do in space syntax. But what you can also see here is those kind of single traces of people doing quite weird things. And those were actually people that I call thinking in action. So these were people thinking, and these were theoretical physicists, by the way, doing highly elaborated kind of thinking tasks. And they were walking up and down the corridor, kind of thinking about things. And actually 30% of the staff told me that thinking is a part of their activity. It links back to studies with brain scanners where there's actually increasing brain activity after you have walked. So movement is not only good for you in terms of health, movement is not only good for meeting other people, it is also good to help you think. So next time you're in the office and are stuck with a problem, get up, move to the water cooler, have a cup of tea. But the movement is the important bit that helps you think. Now, number 4, cellular space is not the end of communication. We hear this a lot in consultancy context with people wanting to do a new office space. Cellular space is so out of fashion, you wouldn't believe it. Everyone thinks cellular space is not good. It's the end of everything. In fact, it is not. What I have here on the top row is results from various organizations that I've looked at where, again, I have network data, frequency of interaction, and there's no clear pattern between the open plan or the cellular. So they range, there's no clear kind of trend. Now, the academic building in Cambridge that I looked at was actually quite interesting because the vast majority of interactions, I think in this case, 62% of interactions did not take place in the cellular offices. So obviously people take their interactions out into the corridors, into the social spaces, and take their offices to concentrate. The most interesting bit, I thought, was that single offices have the highest interactivity, rather than double offices or group offices. So obviously single offices afford a whole range of activities, people coming into the space, meetings taking place. So that actually interactivity in single offices is not that bad. And overall, this had a highly interactive workplace, so 31% of staff were interacting simultaneously at any one point in time. So cellular offices can actually work quite well. Last point, open plan is not always from hell. Who of you has read the Guardian piece last year? Open plan offices are devised in the deepest, something about the Satan in hell. A really nice title, look it up. It was based on a piece of research that colleagues in Australia did, Kim and the Deer. They looked at, I think, 400,000 occupant satisfaction ratings and found that open plan offices are actually the worst that you can have. Cubicles were actually the worst, but fully open plan really ranked quite low on things like, you can have here sound privacy, noise, visual comfort, visual privacy. So in all of those kind of key points, they were not performing quite well. Now, what I would argue is that they are missing an important point. By looking at such a huge database of 40,000 occupant satisfaction ratings, they don't take into account the spatial configuration of the building. And that is clearly what tells me a lot about what is going on in the office. And so I've just put down some of the space syntax analysis of different kind of office buildings. And each of them is very different in what they afford. And the detailed configuration actually makes a huge amount of difference in terms of whether people like the place, whether people actually feel they have privacy, whether people can actually do their job, whether they are good for communication, whether they are good for concentration. So I would argue that the devil really is in the detail, and that you can't, from such a vast kind of statistical analysis, where, by the way, the majority were not open plan offices, you cannot possibly conclude that open plan offices are from hell. So if I just give that brief summary, I would argue that the office is not dead. It's a much needed place for all of us to go to and to do our work. Point number 2, electronic communication patterns tend to replicate our face-to-face interaction patterns. So even though we have the chance to overcome physical spatial barriers by electronic communication, we hardly ever do. So here's food for thought. Movement helps us think and helps us bring people together. Cellular offices are not the end of communication, but likewise, open plan is not always from hell, and both of those can work really well. Now, some of this is contradictory, as you might have spotted. So I would argue that it's always important to look at the individual culture of a place, the individual working processes of a place, that then actually help you to decide what is the right solution for them. And a lot of the kind of thinking that we get where you say, oh, this is always bad or this is always good, I don't think applies. Or in short, you could argue that it's complicated. And with that, I would like to thank you.